so you can hear me. Good morning, Annie. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine, thank you.
This is Annie Tilden, and this is Christina Zaman. We are recording an oral history for our 50th anniversary of Special Collections and Archives. Today is September 14th, 2020. So welcome, Annie, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Christina.
So let's start off with, when were you hired by Georgia State University?
I was hired as a student assistant here in Special Collections in 1983. And I saw the bulletin board of student assistant positions. And I knew after 5 years at home with my daughter, it was time for me to start working outside the home again. And I remember the description vividly. It said, able to lift 30-pound boxes, some French translation work. And having been a French major and priding myself on having a strong back, I applied for the position. And I was hired in the rare book and university archives area by Joe Constance, who did move on from here and became the head of a library in New Hampshire. And I found the work fascinating. It used everything I had learned in academics and as part of my life story. I was raised in a family where both parents were in public life and they were in contemporary political lives. So it was perfect for me. And also I did enjoy the French translation work as a French major in college, and things worked out very, very well.
So what was your position and responsibilities? You talked a little bit about coming on as a student assistant, but you evolved from student assistant to another position.
Yes, I did. I was a student assistant between 83 and 84. Then it became necessary for me to find a full-time job. And I left Special Collections to get a regular staff position at Georgia State. And I worked in a couple of areas at Georgia State. I worked particularly in financial aid. I and one other person were in charge of the financial aid window, where we saw many, many students in very, very stressful positions. And I enjoyed it a great deal. And then I moved to another staff position. But in 1988, I knew that I needed to finish my master's degree, which was actually in adult counseling. So I wanted to find a student assistant position where I would be working part-time and finishing my master's degree with a 9-month internship. And I again called Special Collections. And I was told at first that I would probably be working in the rare books university archives. But then that changed to a higher need, which was with the Southern Labor Archives. And it was fascinating. And as my interest in adult counseling waned, my interest in archives raised. So by the end of my master's degree, I knew that I wanted to become an archivist. So I had to find another job, life's necessities, and there were no full-time positions available in the archives at that point. So I found another job, once again, one of those front desk positions. And actually, although it was in private industry, I did enjoy it a great deal. And I liked work, which was what is now known as multitasking. Back then, it was doing a whole bunch of things at the same time. But at that point, that's what a position like that was called. Then a full-time position did evolve at Georgia State for here as an archival assistant. So I came in and interviewed for the position, and I remember doing somewhat of a presentation, no PowerPoint, but I described what I would probably be focusing on, which was processing, and my soon-to-be, I didn't know, supervisor would be Bob Dinwiddie, and he would be doing both processing and outreach. And then Les Huff, the department head, would be doing a lot of work, including raising money. So I found out that afternoon, it was in 1989, that I had gotten the position. And I was pleased, though, that I was allowed to work out my 2-week notice at my former job. It involved money, and the tradition in that job was to be fired as soon as you received your notice. So, pardon me, coffee is a medicine. Anyway, I received that position. I was thrilled. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and I remember being absolutely elated. And I started shortly before Christmas. I was granted the week between Christmas and New Year's. I'm not sure if it's still a paid week off for, I see Christina nodding her head. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have. And I remember having a vacation right before my my position. Well, I worked, I think, 3 or 4 days, and then was on vacation for a week. And then when I came back, the real meat of the work started. I was doing a lot of processing, but the 30-pound rule was still in effect. So I was bringing over collections for researchers. We then were an unusual labor archives or archives because we allowed access to unprocessed collections. There was not a history of so much confidential information being in the boxes, so we did allow that. And frankly, a lot of books came off the backs of the labor archivist, Bob Dinwiddie, and myself. And that's essentially how I was hired.
Wow. So why did you decide to work at Georgia State, and what attracted you to the position? I know you touched a little bit on this already.
I like the idea of working for a public institution. I was, although I think I have the skills to have been self-employed, I liked the idea of working for an organization, working for a public institution, especially an educational institution. So that was a wonderful part of my work, to be part of an overall organization.
So what was Special Collections and the library like at that time?
The library at that time was quite low tech. We were the first part of the university, though, as far as I know, for each of us to receive a PC, for there to be public access terminals, and that was wonderful for our work. And right away, things began to be put on what we called the computer, and there was not any real, I shouldn't say rhyme or reason, because it was done very well, but there were not a lot of open source utilities for loading archives into computers. And at that time, we really weren't sending emails. We were sending out preliminary inventories, finding aids. They weren't online yet. So we were doing a lot of work. The photocopier, it, of course, I think, ran out of gas. And I remember one thing about the nuts and bolts was that we did not have an edge copier. So it was very difficult to photocopy some of the rarer bound materials, and we did have them in the archives. I think some people have the idea that paper is flying around. Well, a good archives, of course, has bound volumes, reference books. I'm looking here at the rampways, which are the annuals for Georgia State University, the yearbooks. Now, my guess is that they are not, the contents of those are not online. So perhaps, not perhaps, but there would be large amounts of materials that were not online, and there's still some things that are not online. I don't know if you can see the Sanborn maps of the city of Atlanta behind me, but they are not online, and because of the enlargement, there's a good chance that they will not be, but people know that we have them, that you have them, no longer a part of we.
Thank you, Annie. So what was Georgia State like as a university when you worked here?
Well, it was unusual in that it was, in the first incarnation, an evening college, but it quickly branched out to having classes morning, noon, and night, so that it was predominantly an institution where people came at night. They had, like myself, full-time jobs, and we would come at night to go to school. It was not yet a school that had a predominance of people going during the day, but it had decided that it would be a college and then a university, that although it had classes at night, institutionally, there would be no difference between the evening classes and the day classes. You would receive the same degree. So it was a night school without being a night school. And that was very important to many of us. I was a student too. That was extremely important, because then I definitely wanted my master's degree from Georgia State University and not an evening division. Mm-hmm. So we rocked and rolled from 7 a.m. I remember one class got out at 10:50.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's late.
Mm-hmm. That was late.
Wow.
Yes.
So how was Special Collections Archives viewed and supported by the library administration at that time?
I felt that it was highly supported. Both the university librarian, Ralph Russell, and the associate university librarian seemed to know what was going on here, and there has been a tradition of support for the archives, for special collections, and for the variety of entities within special collections. I remember there was a very personal relationship between the administration and particularly staff. I was staff, and a lot of staff at GSU felt they were like a staph infection, STAPH, but the library knew that we were not just staff. And there was a pioneer organization. There was a library council solely for staff members. And several good things did come out of that. And then that grew into being directly from that the Staff Advisory Council for the university, and the then president of the university attended every meeting of the Staff Advisory Council. I was on the Staff Advisory Council for a period of time, and the administration, both in the library and at the university level, there was a good communication. I know my cause for the university was that we have free MARTA cards. The president at that time, I read his resume, and he had 5 earned degrees, and I think 3 were in urban planning. And he fancied himself a big star of urban planning here in Atlanta, and he was. But I really thought that should filter down to taking care of his own first. So we eventually did get a very minor break on the cost of MARTA cards. And I think I've heard that that has increased greatly, if not maybe free.
It's not free.
Not free,
but there's still a
yes,
cost benefit, yeah.
And I definitely enjoyed being part of those organizations, and also addressing issues that some people would not address or did not feel that they had the skills to push forward on.
So what were the department priorities and how did they change during your time?
The priorities changed here and there. The labor archives was not really seen as the then very original core of the archives of special collections. And that kind of waxed and waned during my time here. There were personnel changes where, for instance, the music archives was definitely the flavor of the month for several years. And it caused friction and sadness too.
Mm-hmm. So, in light of the department priorities, what were your priorities while you were here?
My priorities were that I would do a great deal of processing, but I found out that people had shifts in the reading room, and I had no idea when I started out how important that would be to my work. I used every skill I had as a people person. I was in one area an academic. In another area, I was a people person. I felt that my time in the reading room would be of great benefit to anyone who walked in the door. And I particularly enjoyed working with all aspects of special collections, the rare books, the university archives. We then were developing the women's archives, the labor archives, the music archives, and that has continued to this day, where when I read things, I look, of course, in the bibliographies, the notes, to see where things came from. And I had great interests in the visual arts, in archives, labor archives. I felt a great affinity for union people and union organization. I know at that point I was a member, I became a member of the Service Employees International Union, which now is the umbrella organization for almost all unions.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think was your greatest accomplishment?
I have thought a great deal about this, and I really have been mentally divided about this because processing was a very strong suit for me. I knew how to organize things. I could always look at a collection and automatically see where it would go. I know Bob Dinwiddie said, archivists are born, not made. In that there has got to be some kind of cognitive mapping that is wired into your brain. And the two things I found to be fascinating as a child became fascinating for me here. And I just recently traced it back because Beat the Clock and a game where you put cards in order, both on TV, were Concentration. That was the name of the game. I found them to be fascinating. And with processing, I'll just say another word about that. With processing, I found that my goal was to see everything once and to remember as much as I could of what I saw. So that there were, I guess, left, right, brain. I could never get them straight. Anyway, I knew that there was a good chance, because of serendipity or the way things were moving, that many things that I saw would be useful to me later. And then, as I said, I think that some of the books that have been written and the master's theses, the PhDs, I know Michelle Bretain, who is, I believe, still the head of the Department of History, received her degree, her PhD, off work that she was doing here in the labor archives. And I loved that aspect of it. And I would later find out that I went, for instance, we have, I believe, an enormous portfolio of Paul Strand, a very well-known, famous photographer, black and white solely. I think he used a large format camera. I found that the folio, the signed folio that we have here in special collections is far superior to an exhibit I saw of his work in San Francisco. Now, I am probably the only person who knows that. But when I came back here, I could advise the students that this is possibly the best Paul Strand work that you will ever see.
Wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know we had that. I'll have to find it for my treasures. Okay, can you describe the evolution of the department, such as positions, growth, and structural changes that happened?
I would not say that while I was here, which was until 2001, that there were changes structurally, but as far as administration goes, but different areas waxed and waned, just not in a good manner, in a very, very difficult way that impacted all personnel.
And was that based on a combination of who was in library administration and who was in charge of special collections?
No, it waxed and waned because of who was in charge of special collections.
Gotcha.
Who was the head of special collections. And frankly, I've always been a show me the money person. Well, this is one area of life, of a university that should not make its priorities by who gets the money. And the money had a great influence on some people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that. You touched a little bit on this, but were there any new collecting areas added during your time? And if so, what were those collecting priorities for those new collections?
The collecting area that was started while I was here was the women's collection. And there was a part-time archivist who worked like a full-time archivist, Lee Elsroth. I'd like you all to, of course, know her name. And she was doing everything. For instance, neither in labor nor the women's archives was there an exhibit designer. We designed the exhibits. We made the exhibits. It was, from here to there to here. Now, I enjoyed that aspect of the department, but it was shorted. Some areas were definitely shorted.
Mm-hmm.
But that is, I believe, the only area that was added until 2000.
Okay. So where were you getting your materials and collections? Who was your donor base? And I know that wasn't necessarily the type of position that you were in, but do you have some?
Oh, I went out with Bob on almost every collecting trip. And because Bob had been and was a labor person, he was in extremely close contact with all the organizations and many of the individuals, so that he knew whom to reach out to and when to reach out to those people. Now, I know occasionally a labor person who was acquainted with the Southern Labor Archives would pop up on our radar with a phone call. Perhaps that person had passed away, and his wife here in Atlanta knew of the Labor Archives. She would call up and say, I have some things. Well, of course, some things would turn out to be an enormous utility shed full, and Bob would rent a U-Haul truck, and he and I would go out and do the heavy lifting, literally heavy lifting. It was what Bob called real work, and we were constantly, I would say about every 2 or 3 weeks, we'd go over to Alumni Hall and attempt to get things in order.
So, were there any major events or momentous occasions when you worked here? Major celebrations?
Well, there was a celebration every year for the Mercer collection. There would occasionally, very occasionally, be a gathering for the labor archives, but not that often.
And what was the space like? Were you here for one of the moves or space reorganizations?
Thank you. I was not here for one of the moves. When I started working as a student assistant in the department, the collection, special collections, was in what now is not Alumni Hall. I'm not sure of the
Dahlberg
name.
Hall. It's Dahlberg Hall.
Dahlberg Hall, then Alumni Hall. And when I came back in '89, it was over here. But we did have major events in that there were a lot of leaks. There were a lot of leaks. I see Christina's nodding her head. There were a lot of leaks in Alumni Hall. There were major leaks in this area. Maybe it's not a, I guess it's an open secret, so I'll mention it. But what comes to mind is that archives are told do not be on the top floor, which is the special collections here, and do not be on the bottom floor, which is the archives, which I still probably has holdings in Alumni Hall. But that brings us to one of the problems in archives, that it is frequently the poor relative of a library. It's kind of tacked on so that the archives people rarely have a say in where the archives will be.
Yep, that's very true. Very true. All of our collections are either on the top floor or sub-level or ground level, which causes the usual problems. So what challenges did you face, and were you able to overcome them? And this is for you personally.
I really don't like heights that much, but I would go over to Alumni Hall and climb the 10-foot ladder, and pull things off the top, put them on the small space that the ladder has, and go down the steps with the box. Unfortunately for me, I thought that I had my father's strength. He was a farmer up until the day he died. In fact, that morning he was still farming. And he was extremely strong, early, middle age, and older. And I did not have the strength to sustain work. Well, fortunately, through my working life, I was able to lift and carry very, very heavy things. And I actually became proud of being able to climb the 10-foot ladder and pull things off. I can see now that a practice we had was that we frequently worked alone, so that I would go over to Alumni Hall, climb the 10-foot ladder, pull off the collection, the boxes that we needed, and that is really not a good practice. You need to have two people. Even if one just always stands at the bottom, you need two people doing that. So that was a skill that I developed that I actually enjoyed.
Yeah, that 10-foot ladder's still over there. It's a little scary. I've been on it. So what challenges did Special Collections and Archives face? And you've mentioned a few, like leaks and some other things, but were there other challenges that they faced?
I think I've thought about this too. It comes down, I think, to one thing: money. You know, I have wonderful memories of that movie, Show Me the Money. And it gets translated sometimes into how people behave. It is sometimes people feel diminished by not having the showy things. Now I come to the department and the diamonds are everywhere, and that's a wonderful feeling. Wonderful.
I'm glad you saw our improvements. So what was the actual physical campus like at Georgia State University while you were here?
Well, the courtyard was a big thing. Of course, it was many steps up. As I see things now from the perspective of a disabled, I hate to admit it, I stigmatize my own disabilities. But anyway, I see that it is still one poor campus. That courtyard is still there. I doubt if there are any close by elevators going up to general classroom building. It's daunting. Because I was staff, I can picture where the elevators are, but I can see that it is not a disabled-friendly place. I actually had an experience where I wanted to register for a class. This was a few years ago. I was using a cane. Everything was closed on Sparks Hall, in Sparks Hall. There were no chairs anywhere in the hallway. I had not graduated to using a walker where I can always sit down. I banged on a door. I had to invoke the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then the problems continued to the point where I did not register for a free class. Now, I hope that the campus has changed, but at that point, it had not at all. The elevators were not marked anywhere. There was this feeling, we don't use the elevators unless we have to. You know? And I saw that from a very well-abled person, but now it's different. And our population is growing older by the minute, and 70 is not the new 50.
Yeah, they did finally add a ramp just last year, I believe, over at Sparks Hall. But they're making some progress. Slow.
Yes.
Slow, but they're making progress.
Well, it's something that needs to be done to have an absolute priority, because there is a federal act, there's an 800 number, there's a compliance officer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now, I rarely have to move into that area, but occasionally I do, and here at GSU, I have to.
Yeah. Yes, it's a very vertical campus, but not a lot of access points for those with disabilities.
Mm.
It's definitely a challenge. Were there women in leadership roles here in the library?
Yes,
Or in the
there
university?
were several women department heads. The associate university librarian was a woman, and she had her doctorate, which is unusual for an associate or an assistant dean. I'm not sure if it's still unusual, but it was unusual at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the upper hierarchy at the university was mostly middle to older white men.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much the same now. It's a little change. But.
Mm-hmm.
What was the most unique item that you've worked with? Might be your favorite thing, I don't know.
I don't have any favorites
Oh.
in special collections and archives. I really don't. But I will never forget a day that I was in Alumni Hall, and we had received the entire library of the Association of International Machinists, all the books. They filled, well, one range, not up and down, but I think 2 or 3 shelves. And I decided, after I did my real work, that I would walk down the range, because I had not done that. And so I walked down the range back and forth. I guess subconsciously I was learning pretty much what was there, but there was an older bound volume, and I could tell it was very old. So I pulled it out, and it was reports of people working in consulates throughout the world, studying labor in those countries. And it was done in the 1880s, 1890s. So I took the book, and it was fascinating. Let me tell you, that's the secret about archives. You do see fascinating things every day. It's a secret. Anyway, because I guess you can't admit that to your supervisors, because they might think you're, taking time off. But anyway, I paged through a lot of it, and it had labor practices in Russia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. Well, back then there really, I wouldn't say, there was not so much nationalism, regionalism. We had not yet had the Nazis visit upon us. So it was kind of free-floating. you could have a Tsar of Russia, who was related to every major house of royalty in Western Europe closely. Anyway, so I paged through this, and I thought, this is really fascinating. And I remember thinking, I was fortunate because I always saw things, I guess, in a futuristic way, in that I wanted those books to be cataloged, every single one of them. And I believe we started sending them to a person in cataloging. I remember the person's name, Tina Demetrikopoulos, who did original cataloging, not copy cataloging, but original cataloging. Now, I don't know if that book ever made it over there, but anyway, I digress. But I can see that you're shaking your head, Christina, so it could well be that those books are cataloged now. Okay, I saw that book. I was fascinated by it. The next day, I was on reference duty, which for me was not an interruption, because I enjoyed it. Well, fortunately, we had begun to refer people to the different areas that they specialized in, so that you weren't, well, the rude expression is palmed off. You were handed to someone who could really assist you. Mm-hmm. Well, I got a call from someone abroad, which was not that unusual, really. And the person said, I cannot find anything that will help my research. I am looking for material on labor practices in the 1890s. Now, this was the very next day. And I remember saying to the person, today is your very lucky day. Now, I said to the person, I am going to attempt to photocopy the material that you need, but we do not have an edge copier. That was the refrain. We do not. Now, why that wasn't translated into a budget, I don't know. But it was a refrain. And I said, but what I will do is, if any of the information is missing, I will hand print the information on the copies I send you, and I will sign it and say that this is a true copy. So I did that. He got what he needed. I received word that he had received the material. But that was one hell of a lucky day.
Yeah, I do find that, and sometimes you're frustrated because you can't find it for the researcher, and 6 months later you find that thing.
You find that thing. This was the perfect marriage of two experiences.
Yeah.
And I feel very fortunate because, unlike some people, I think my memory has increased as I've aged.
So maybe this is the same as the story you just related, but do you have what is your most memorable story from
That
Georgia
is
State?
it.
That is
I'm
it.
sorry, we skipped
Oh, that's okay.
questions.
So then where did you go after Georgia State?
After Georgia State, I became a library associate, records coordinator, archivist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. I got a part-time job there after my hours at Georgia State. And hindsight is wonderful. I deeply regret having left Georgia State, even though when I went to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, I received almost 3 times the pay.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make a huge difference. But it doesn't necessarily mean you're happy in it.
No, not difference enough.
Yeah. Do you have anything else? Anything else that comes to mind? Any stories or recollections about your time here that you'd like to share?
Of my working life, it was the very best time, but it was time that, with my previous experiences, I needed all of them to do what I hope was very good work at Georgia, at Special Collections.
Mm-hmm.
I needed those other positions, even hearkening back to being a records coordinator at the Massachusetts Parole Board, or working a summer job there in corporations and taxation, because I knew I was becoming expert in what fields we needed. It was key punch cards.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing what fields would be crucial for auditors to know. And that translates into here. Now, there are 2 things I would like to share. From another person doing physical moves, I learned, not an archivist, this was a homeowner, I learned that 3 moves equals a fire. And I remember trying to find a place on campus that read floppy disks.
Mm.
There was one machine in the general classroom building, and it didn't do a good job at all. So what that means now, the University of Michigan, I think, still collects computer equipment from the dark ages, so perhaps that could be done. But I'm sure it costs a fair amount of money, and who knows what kind of backlog they have. So my suggestion is that you need to keep the old technology. I have heard that where I worked at the Federal Reserve Bank, that all the microfilm readers are gone. Of course, I did read not that long ago that microfilm, because it's analog, is still perhaps the best form of reproduction. Okay. The only other thing I want to add is, and I think this might be unique to me, I have had a lot of people recently, because I've moved to a retirement residence, have asked me what I did. Now, some people catch on right away, but I would say most people do not. So I tell them briefly, and then I say, archivists decide what history will be.
Well, thank you, Annie.
Oh,
this is such a
thank
pleasure
you
talking
so
to you.
much. This
I really
was
appreciate
wonderful.
Yes, thank you. And I can't believe that we're coming up on our 50th anniversary.
That
Exciting.
shows how old I am.
Well, you weren't here from the beginning, so. Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. This